So actually, just a little parenthetical story on E.F. Hutton. So I met E.F. Hutton for a couple of years, and I don't know if you remember a guy named Marchenkas. Anybody remember Marchenkas? Marchenkas was the one who was managing the Vatican's money. And he either committed suicide or was murdered. He was found hung from the London Bridge. Now, when that occurred, it turns out that Gianni Piacatelli, who was a broker in London, called up the Home Office in New York and said, look, I think we can get the money, and then we'd be able to say, when E.F. Hutton talks, the Vatican listens. And so Bob Foman, who was running E.F. Hutton at the time, got very excited. And he looked through, who had a job of some prominence with an Italian last name, and I was one of only two. So they sent us, me and Bob Artesone. We went to the Vatican. We met with Gianni Piacatelli beforehand, and he explained that we were going to go in. It would all be in Italian, which neither of us could speak, of course. And that at the appropriate moment, we needed to kneel down and kiss the cardinal's ring, and then it would continue. And so we did precisely that, and we went, in the back where you never get to go with all these incredible paintings. And so we meet with his uncle, kiss the ring, and the uncle explains to him that this other cardinal is in charge of the money, and that's way across on the other side of the courtyard in the Vatican. And as we're being escorted across, there's a Monsignor taking us across who happened to be from Chicago, so he did speak something that was like English. And he put his arm around me as we got to the big door on the other side of the big courtyard, and he said to me, just remember, in the Vatican, trust no one. And anyway, it was a great story from my Italian Catholic family that Christmas Eve. But yes, needless to say, we didn't get the money. Okay, so I want to start out, actually, a little bit more ridiculously, with a little poem that I couldn't help myself with, in light of a lot of what the pundits have been alluding to, unfortunately. So, mass Syrian exit, growing risk of Brexit, China elites exiting stage right, Putin, Trump, Le Pen itching for a fight, pundits quote Yeats as they watch the world unfold, gyrations are increasing and the center cannot hold. So where do we find ourselves? I think we find ourselves asking a rather elemental set of questions right now, okay? Elemental questions about can the neoliberal synthesis resurrect itself, the Washington consensus? Is there an evolutionary way out of what looks like a pretty dire circumstance? We've got 99% in the US that, God, they disagree on so many things, but they agree on one thing, the 99%. And they agree that it's not a fair deal or a new deal, but a raw deal. Okay, and Bernie's calling for a revolution, and the Donald is, I guess, threatening a devolution. But the thing that animates both or many of the supporters of both is a frustration that they think they're not really a part of anything that's good or that has any upside. So to me, it begs a question, okay? Not to sound like J. Alfred Prufrock, but are there steps that are available within the conventional framework that could address many of the concerns that the 99% are talking about? Or really, are we faced with a moment where it just gets worse unless we are revolutionary or devolutionary? Okay? Now, truth in advertising, I am very biased about this. If you think about the neoliberal synthesis, not neoliberal in the sense that they use in the UK or Europe 75 years ago, but neoliberal in the sense that was used in the US in the 1980s. Okay, I'm very biased because most people would say that the beginnings of that framework and that ideology, if it was an ideology, was really constructed by Paul Tsongas, the senator from Massachusetts, sort of one of the first neoliberals. You could say that Clinton operated under that framework, but that Tsongas hammered it out. Okay, and I did work for Tsongas. I was 27 and wet behind the ears and had nothing to do with the first construct. But I did spend a lot of time thereafter running down a lot of rabbit holes and coming to appreciate what he was talking about. So my bias would be that framework still has some legitimate opportunity to deal with some things here. But I wanted to be honest that it is, it is a bias. Tsongas used to talk about the critical point was pragmatism in lieu of ideology. That if you were pragmatic about dealing with problems, you could make some progress, and if you were all caught up with an ideology, you could go down rabbit holes that really didn't make a lot of sense. I remember vividly when I was on the banking committee for him, and we were bailing out Chrysler. This is the first bailout. Not the most recent one. 1979, and if you looked at their financials, they were clearly desperately bankrupt. And so the game was, okay, take all the stakeholders, figure out how they could cough up something significant. And if all the stakeholders coughed up something significant, you could actually be in a place where, notwithstanding the recession, notwithstanding the onslaught of Japanese cars that were cheaper, more fuel efficient, and a lot better, that they could survive. Okay, and a part of that was a 3-year wage freeze that he proposed at the time. And I remember being in a room with 25 people from the UAW fearing for my life. And I think it's important now to think about that because that was a very different time. And to try to put that in context, how many of you remember the Woody Allen movie Sleeper? Sleeper. Okay, well, Sleeper, right? He goes to get his ulcer fixed. He wakes up. It's 500 years later. He's in this dystopian society, and there's been a big nuclear war, and now they're fighting against the leader. And as he's waking up and finding out what went on, there was a nuclear war? Yeah. So, oh my God, the US and Russia? And the woman says, no. A man named Albert Shanker got a hold of a nuclear device. Okay, Albert Shanker was the president of the New York State Teachers Association. Okay, he was a union leader. Who possibly today could substitute in that movie line for Albert Shanker? Nobody. There's nobody plausibly that virulent, visible, and crazy. Okay, but if we wanted virulent, visible, and crazy, we have a lot of people to put in place, right? We've got Rush Limbaugh, okay? We've got Glenn Beck. So you can see what's happened then from a sort of a Tsongas pragmatic perspective. Unreasonable demands from ardent lefties in 1980 was the reality. Albert Shanker. We've got the same unreasonable demands from a set of ideologues today. It's on the other side of the aisle. Okay, and so I don't think you have to reject the neoliberal synthesis and the notion of pragmatism. All right, now, we then have to talk about today's policymakers. How might one think pragmatically about our problems? Well, we have the President and the Congress, and we have the FOMC. Now, I know there's a lot of enthusiasm here for Bernie, okay? He is an avowed socialist. Mitch McConnell, though, and I would argue Boehner, actually Marx, really Marx. Those two are really Marxists. And I know that sounds odd to all of you, but I went back, I got out the Grundrisse, all right, see, I read the Grundrisse, all right, okay. I couldn't finish it. Somebody said to me, how could you? I said, well, I know how it ends. And I found the quote, and you tell me, right? Because McConnell comes out and says, what is my number one job? What's McConnell's number one job? To make sure that Obama is a one-term president.
My number one job is not to maximize the social welfare of the citizens of the U.S.
My number one job is not to maximize the social welfare of the citizens of my state. My number one job is to make sure that Obama fails. So I went back and I found the quote. Your proposition may be good, but let's have one thing understood. Whatever it is, I'm against it. And even when you change it or condense it, I'm against it. Now that's pure Marx. It's Groucho, but it's pure Marx. Okay, that's a great song. You should pull it up. I was going to sing it, but I just can't do it. I don't have a harmonica. So what that means to me is two things, okay? And I'll get back to the first one in a minute. What it means is, to quote someone who most of you may be mad at times, which is Larry Summers, and I just happen to agree with this, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Right? What are gains from trade? I'm not talking about international trade. I'm talking about gains from political trade. If I'm sitting there and we look at one another and I say, if we make this swap, I'm 10 times better off and you're 1 time better off. But I can't let you be 1 time better off because you're Obama. Then you're denying yourself obvious middle-of-the-road steps that could be advantageous to a great many. And that's really what we've had now for 8 years, okay? What have we had in the interregnum? Then we've had monetary policy. So let me spend the lion's share of this talk will be on monetary policy. It's been the only game in town, here, there, and everywhere. That's very disappointing, not to my way of thinking, the rational approach right now. But for the moment, it's all we've got. Okay? So, I don't believe you have to be radical in thinking about monetary policy, but I think you have to really think about it. And there are some shibboleths or simple notions that upon closer inspection don't hold up. So what's the conventional approach? Don't gag, but we'll start with a Taylor rule. Okay, so what's U star? Well, 5%. What's pi star? 2%. Well, where's the unemployment rate? 5.1. Where's the core CPI? 2.2. QED, right? We're fine. Okay. In addition, we've got a low prime age participation rate, but what it is. And we know that the population is getting older, and as people slide into those cohorts where they don't work much, the participation rate will continue to decline. And so if you take that at face value, you say, well, I've met my 2 goals, and I want now a stable trajectory for unemployment. And with the participation rate falling, that means, and I did the arithmetic on the train coming up, and it's 60,000 a month. So you can afford to have 60,000 a month new job creation without the unemployment rate declining. Okay? Let's say that you're feeling gracious and you say, well, over the next 2 years, we'll allow it to fall to 4.5%. Well, that would allow 100,000. Now, the employment data has been sort of 225, 235 on average for the last 3, 6, 12, and 24 months. So that means you're growing at twice the rate that the simple, I would say simple-minded model suggests you should be growing at. And that's where you could have someone talk about normalization and why we need to quickly get rates nearer to neutral because we don't want to really be growing in excess of what our labor supply will allow us to do. Okay. Now, why is that? Because, of course, if we allow that to occur, bad things will happen. What are those bad things? Well, I guess the bad things, the only way to work it is, if employment grows too quickly, then the unemployment rate falls too far, and if it falls too far, wages accelerate too rapidly, and if they accelerate too rapidly, we get a big inflation problem, and it endures, and we have to have a recession. Okay, so that's the moniker that would say, now's the time to begin to step on the brake. Okay. It's simple, it's neat, and I think it's almost certainly wrong. And wrong not in the sense that it can't turn out to be true. wrong in the sense that there are 1,000 other ways that it might unfold. Okay, a colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins who writes very obliquely, you know, I wrote for 20 years on Wall Street trying to sound as bombastic as possible. He wrote for 20 years at the Fed trying to, you know, you need to decipher it. But if you decipher the paper he delivered at Jackson Hole in August of last year, it's called The Myth of Normal by John Faust and Eric Leeper. What he talks about is how all these relationships are lovely as a pedagogic tool to talk to your students about, but in fact, they don't withstand the test of any scrutiny. And he starts with inflation and points out that if you forecast inflation based on where we are in the business cycle, and he forecasts inflation on, I think this is what it looks like, he beats you. Okay, that it doesn't have any predictive value to know where the unemployment rate is, how long the expansion is going, that relationship falls apart. So what I see then right now is between letting employment grow rapidly and having a pernicious and sustained inflation that gives us a big problem, I see 6 degrees of separation. Okay, what are the 6 degrees of separation? Good play, by the way. Well, participation rate may rebound. Unemployment may fall, but wages may not accelerate. Unemployment may fall, wages may accelerate, but labor productivity may accelerate, so we can accept it. Unemployment may fall, wages may accelerate faster than labor productivity, but maybe as wages go up as a share of national income and we don't get an acceleration for inflation. Unemployment may fall, wages may accelerate, wage rates real may accelerate faster than labor productivity, and inflation may accelerate, but after 4 years of being under forecast and, or under target, and 2 years meaningfully under target, a couple of years above target would be fine. And 6th, I'll leave for last. All right, now that was meant to be a whirlwind. Now let me try to defend it. The participation rate. I said 60,000 a month, baby, that's all you get. Okay, that's all you get if prime age participation doesn't rebound. All right, prime age participation, 25 to 54. Why should 25 to 54 have fallen as hard as it did? Ex post, we all accept it and people come up with rationales, but it's quite reasonable to believe that it might rebound in a hot labor market as it has over the last 8 months. Now, let's do a little arithmetic. Let's say participation across all the other age cohorts stays the same. You know, the 16 to 24-year-olds, the over 65, everything's the same except for prime age. And let's say over the next 2 years, prime age participation goes from 81.4 to 83.4. 2 percentage points. Doesn't get back to 84.4 where it was in 2000 when the unemployment rate was 3.8, but it gets back to 83.4. Suddenly you discover that you've got 160,000 a month instead of 60,000 a month in growth in the labor force. If we then allow the unemployment rate again to fall to 4.5%, now we're talking about another 2 years of over 200,000 payrolls as a trajectory that won't give you a problem in terms of the unemployment rate because you've had a big rebound for labor participation. Okay? Let's say you don't have that much of a rebound and the unemployment rate goes to 4%. In a wildly deflationary world that we've been confronting, it's not ipso facto, it's not categorical that we get a big acceleration for wages. So it may turn out that the participation rate rises some, that the unemployment rate falls more than you thought it would, but you still don't have an acceleration for wages. Okay. What about if wages accelerate? And what about if wages accelerate, adjusted for inflation, faster than labor productivity? Now this is the Holy Grail here. This is where you run into the doctrinaire, well, we can't let that happen, right? Because if real wages rise faster than labor productivity, that is upward pressure on unit labor costs, and we're in trouble. Now, the thing I love about that, and I really do love that, because I probably heard that from 50 economists over the last 6 months or 12 months on CNBC, some of whom are labor economists and lefties. Well, you know, we want productivity to accelerate so we can get real wages to accelerate. But we understand that we can't let real wages run faster than productivity. Well, okay, but I went to this other seminar 3 days ago, and everybody talked about how we're psychotically depressed because wages fell as a share of national income. But the only way they can go up as a share of national income is if real wages accelerate faster than labor productivity. It's the only way to get them back up. It's an accounting identity. Okay, so allowing for the fact that you could have real wages. So let's do some arithmetic. First, it's de rigueur now to point out that real wages have been falling or didn't keep up with productivity since 1980. Now that's unfair. It is true, but if you look at the data, what you really had was up, down, 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 up, and the peak for 2000 was higher than the other two peaks. It's really from 2000 to 2013 that you take a big hit in terms of wages share of GDP. So you go from 55 to 57.5, 3 times. And then from 2000 to 2013, you go from 57.5 all the way down to 53. Right? That's where it really gets nailed. It's at 54 now. We've had a 1-year rally for wages as a share of income, unfortunately largely because income didn't go up. That is national income. So let's pause it again. Let's say over the next 2 years that we allow wages as a share of nominal GDP to go from 54 to 55, so 0.5% a year for 2 years. What does that mean for average hourly earnings? It means that if inflation is 1.5 this year, wages will be 3.5 with productivity at 1. And if inflation is 2 next year, wages will be 4 with productivity at 1. Okay, so 3.5 and 4 for wages in that construct simply lifts wage earners' share of national income and does nothing of any substance to the inflation rate. Okay? Now, alternatively, we could begin to see some pressure on inflation. What's inflation done recently? Well, it's been below 2 for 4 years. The core rate's been below 2 for 4 years. We use the PCE deflator core, and we're talking about 1.3, 1.4 over the last 2 years. Well, we want to be symmetric. How about 2.7, 2.6 over the next 2 years? And I have a calculator that does this for me. It sounds like it averages to 2. So if we're not apoplectic about 1.3, 1.4, we don't have to be apoplectic about 2.6, 2.7 for a couple of years. If that unfolding allows for some of this to go on with participation, with wage earners' share, we could find ourselves in a situation where a consequence of leverage, and I'm not talking about Minsky's leverage, I'm talking about leverage in the labor market. A consequence of leverage in the labor market, wage earners could get a rising share over the next several years. And I see that as vanilla ice cream monetary policy rather than a radical set of steps that would need to be taken. And if that unfolded at the margin, it might be positive, in fact, reasonably positive for that 99%. Okay, what's the sixth? The sixth, Road Less Traveled. Anybody read The Road Less Traveled? It's a shrink book, one of the earlier shrink books. Anyway, the shrink in the book points out he's treating this woman in Okinawa. She's married to a major or something, U.S., and she had attempted suicide, and he's working with her, and this is, she explains to him, she's just trapped. She's trapped. She doesn't have anybody she can deal with, nothing to do, and she's just, life is not worth living. And Why are you trapped? Well, you know, my husband, he's in the army and he's all over the place and he never takes me. And, well, why don't you go out? Well, you know, I don't know how to drive. And, well, why don't you learn how to drive? And she goes, are you kidding? You see the way people drive in Okinawa? You could get killed. Wait a minute now. So I'm going to kill myself. Okay. If I'm running the Fed right now, I see people who are saying, let's go to the gold standard. Or I see Levin at Dartmouth saying, let's completely restructure the whole place. Geez, I'd let her rip for a while here in terms of the 6 degrees of separation. Okay, now, low-hanging fruit. Okay, it is true that nothing by design was allowed to be done for the last several years. That's pretty extraordinary. When I worked in the Senate for Songus, the funniest thing about working in the Senate, when I got there, I thought, I know who our enemies are, you know, and the real right-wingers, and I know who our close brethren are, you know, Hart and Bradley, and it turned out it was exactly the opposite. Hart and Bradley, we were competing for the moniker of neoliberal, and so we hated them, we hated their staffers. The lunatics on the right, they were fine and they were idiots, and we didn't have to worry about it. So it was a really different construct. But you cut deals. You really did cut deals, right? You made negotiations, and as a consequence, you were able to get things done. So, low-hanging fruit. And this is completely and utterly, you know, anecdotal and not meant to be comprehensive. And I'm not running for anything. So I started out as an economist studying oil. I was a resource economist and actually looking at shale oil and oil shale. So that's sort of interesting right now. And I remember reading Solow and Nordhaus on building models associated with the optimal extraction of oil. What's the optimal strategy to extract oil? Okay, if you pull out the Nordhaus models, what he said, and this is great because it's 1974, he says, well, all right, first we got to think of a backstop technology that has limitless supplies, but, you know, obviously probably at a very high price. And he said, well, that would be solar. Sort of interesting today, right? All right, so we've got this backstop technology, and we've got then the real price rises up until you get to that backstop technology. So you could imagine Saudi Arabia, it's 2006, and the story is China, India, this big boom, rising real demands. We are drilling in Antarctica, we're drilling outside of Angola, we're doing all these things that cost $100, $125, $130 a barrel. So they're comfortably figuring we can produce at 11 million barrels a day over the next 60 years, which happens to work out arithmetically. Over 60 years, they will have drained the big puddle of oil they have in the sand. Okay, a reasonable strategy, right? Now, what occurs in the intervening years? In the intervening years, we have a wild change in the economics of batteries and of solar. Much more competitive at much lower prices. And of course, we get fracking. Now you're in a situation where you could say, well, they could cut their production right now as they did in 85, 86. 85, 86, Saudi Arabia, for a year and a half, cut their production by 70%. Okay, they could cut their production to 3 million barrels a day and get the price back up to 80 bucks. Okay, and let's say they did that and they held that in place for 15 years. They could hold that in place for 15 years and preserve very, very efficient and profitable frackers. And the frackers would fill in the gap over that 15 to 20 years until you ran into the backstop technology. When you run into the backstop technology, then solar takes over, and all of a sudden Saudi Arabia discovers that they've got 2/3 of their oil under the ground and nobody wants it anymore. Remember, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. So they've got a calculation that suggests, well, geez, maybe we really don't want to make sure the price stays high and the frackers are okay. And then you superimpose another thing on it. Okay, Now, if you're giving speeches about why global warming is a fraud and it's all a manufactured story, that you can give those speeches. But then there's your wallet and protecting your wallet. You got to assign some probability to global warming being true. In fact, you have to assign some probability, let's call it 15%, to the dire forecasts associated with global warming to be true. So if 15 years from now, Florida's mostly gone, you think anybody's going to be happy if you're burning crude oil? So you have to say, well, there's some non-zero probability that they're going to shut us down over the next 20 years if this turns out to be, and you'd have to put that into your calculus as well. And I have a chart on a paper I did on this. Is there any precedent for this? It's a 100-year chart of imports of asbestos into the UK. And boy, they grow like mad, and then they just collapse. I don't understand what happened. So you put all of that together, and then what it says is, well, maybe Saudi Arabia's come to the conclusion that it would be a good idea to sell it now at 30 to 60 bucks, rather than try to protect a price, okay? Now, what's our response been so far? Well, we have 62 senators and a long list of congressmen who are emphatic that we've got to get the Keystone Pipeline built. The Keystone Pipeline is basically set up to take oil, down through the US. The only person who was against it, you got to give him credit for this, although his rationale is a little crazy, Donald Trump was against the Keystone Pipeline. Now, you know why he's against the Keystone Pipeline? He said because it's like cruise. It starts in Canada and it ends up in Texas. A reasonable response might be, okay, that we don't want to slow the move to solar and batteries because we have some of us believe in science and are concerned about global warming. So we don't want to slow that, and that probably means, I don't know, $1.50 at the pump. And you give it all back. Right? You give it all back to anybody who makes less than 100 grand. Okay, so you've got a tax cut on the payroll income side, so it's revenue neutral, notwithstanding the fact that it also continues to say, head towards electric cars. You might even also buy up, because you can get them for nothing right now. You might buy up a lot of the fracking sites. Right? We've got a strategic petroleum reserve. Think about, because we've got two risks, right? We've got global warming over here, and then we've got a really hot situation in the Middle East where Iran and Saudi Arabia, boy, that doesn't look happy. And if you said to me, is there any chance that oil could be $250 a barrel? Sure. And we all know how it would be, and it would be military, and it would be horrible. But if you were in the possession of all this potentially frackable properties, you'd be in a position to respond. The petroleum reserve with a 6 to 12 month lag would be much larger, and you'd be basically buying insurance incredibly cheaply. Okay, a second, and then I'll stop and open it up for questions. And my only point is how low-hanging the fruit is right now relative to what we've been thinking about. On the income side, you really can make a lot of progress simply by having a much more progressive tax code, right? That doesn't solve all things for all people, but if you let it run hot and the unemployment rate was low when labor had some leverage and the upper side, the taxes went up materially, providing some room to cut on the lower end, you could make real progress there too. And so my point here is if Tsongas or someone like him, if you said, you're in charge and you can get things done, I think you could get a lot done and it could look a lot better. And the idea that we've failed with these more moderate approaches, to me, is not right. We haven't had moderate approaches. We've had complete dysfunction and nothing getting done for what amounts to a decade. And so in honor of my old boss, Paul Tsongas, who's no longer with us, I don't think neoliberalism is the problem. I think the problem is complete lack of any real policy for what amounts to almost a decade. Thank you all, and I'll take questions. Yes, sir.
I'd like your reaction to two factoids. I saw a report that said that the crosstabs in Democratic primaries showed a
Glass.
large proportion of voters in the Democratic primaries self-identifying as liberals. And I don't think you could conceivably imagine people responding that way 8 years ago, so something's happening on the D side. The second thing is, my sense is that the Reagan supply-side revolution that was appropriately labeled voodoo economics in 1980 has now essentially discredited itself empirically. Nobody actually believes that, even though you see it in the
Well, we would have to, just to interrupt, every Republican candidate is running on that.
Yes.
Okay, well, but I think you're one election away from being able to say what you just said. All right, so the question is, or the statement was, isn't it true that a lot more people are self-identified as liberals? I think since Bernie made it okay to be a socialist, it's clearly okay to be a liberal. And the second point is, hasn't supply-side voodoo economics been demonstrated to be false? The second piece, well, it was demonstrated to be false in 1984, okay, but it's been the centerpiece of the Republican platform ever since. And so I was not being funny when I said we're one election away from being able to say everyone recognizes that it's, you know, when Art Laffer, I'm going to tell you an Art Laffer story. So this is true. I'm in the Pentagon. See, you know, Vatican, Pentagon, I get around. So I'm in the Pentagon, and Mullins is the head of the Joint Chiefs at the time, and we're giving a briefing, and there are 6 of us, and I was in charge of speaking about energy, and I stated, you know, painfully obvious things, and pointed out that the 7th Fleet is there, and we spend this enormous amount on defense associated with the Middle East, and it might be nice to make a big push towards solar, battery, and everything, and make our interaction there a lot less economically important. And Art Laffer, who was there, got up and he banged the table and he goes, "My God, don't you know any, Ricardo? Don't you know anything about gains from trade? I mean, they've got this oil and we've got this." And I'm sitting there looking. And then one of the other economists there, who was an ardent Republican, stood up and looked at Art and said, "Art, we're in the war room." Okay, you know, wars triumph gains from trade. And when Art drew the Laffer curve, the top rate was 70%. Okay, now I'm not saying it was right then. I don't think cutting taxes from 70 to 60 raises revenues. But 70%, it was an interesting notion. You knew he was right if you went from 70 to 100. Okay, very few people go to work if 100% of your revenue, of your income goes to taxes. But if you look at where the tax rates are now, it's theater of the absurd to profess that revenues would go up if taxes were cut. My biggest fear in that regard, by the way, I worked at the Congressional Budget Office for a couple of years. The Congressional Budget Office, conventional wisdom, and they tell you that we have a big debt problem. Debt to GDP is going to go from 73 to 105% of GDP over the next 25 years, and that's a problem. Now, they don't mention the fact that it's 230% in Japan and their bond yields is negative, but they insist it's a problem. Why is it a problem? Well, if you look at their numbers, the primary deficit, according to their forecast, is 1.5% of GDP in 25 years. So how the hell does the debt go up? The reason the debt goes up is because they have an interest rate, okay, that's 50 basis points above the real GDP growth rate, the real interest rate. Notwithstanding the fact that for the last 50 years, the real interest rate that the government borrows at is 70 basis points below the real growth rate. And all you have to do is say, I got an idea, I'm going to run your numbers, but I'm going to use the historical 50-year average for R minus G. There's no deficit problem. There's no debt problem. It's gone. It's completely captive to your assumption about what the real growth rate is versus the inflation rate. Now, why do I bring that up? Because you could cut taxes and end up with a much smaller deficit problem than anybody thought, not because you knew anything about taxes, but because the forecast of deficits is all wrong because they've got the wrong R minus G. So I would propose fiscal stimulus and say that we had a multiplier of 4, and all it really would be, I'd be changing R minus G. Another question. Yes, sir.
Did anyone at Pentagon give you the trust factor?
I wondered why we were in the Pentagon. Why did they invite us there? And of course, he was just meeting with people he thought were politically connected because he was worried about the defense budget. He didn't care about our analysis. Another question? Yes, sir.
Do you think the obstructionism of McConnell would have just surfaced if somebody else was the Republican leader in the Senate?
Do I think that the McConnell's obstructionism is idiosyncratic to him, or is it generic to the party? Boy, we got a lot of data here, don't we? It looks like it has been the strategy. I must say the obstruction in terms of the Supreme Court appointment, to me, is striking because you didn't have to do it, right? I mean, you were in a perfect position to play nice and turn them down. And so it actually was quite striking. Game theory, I can't get my way around it. I don't know.
Fair primary.
Yeah, well, that's right. You know what? The primary, what was his name? Cantor. I mean, who could be more ardently right-wing than Cantor? Well, they found someone, and Cantor was out, and he's in. Any more? Yes, sir.
You talked about tax policies for individuals. Comment on tax policy for corporations, especially with inversions and some of the other things going on.
Yeah, what we've got, obviously, across a lot of categories, both tax policy and monetary policy, and I apologize for this, I skipped a bit of the speech, but when you put things in international context, increasingly we've got, to state the brutally obvious, we have large multinational firms that can pick and choose where they do what, and we have national tax codes. This was, 80 years ago, it was the reason all the rivers were so polluted, because you had various municipalities that had individual control, and you couldn't come to a common solution. I imagine, if you want to dream dreams, right, you might have an election in which someone actually was in charge across categories of government, a consequence of a particular one or two people who one side put up. And in such a circumstance, you could actually have tax overhaul on both sides. But I think the problem you've got, again, is you're dealing with how do I do it within the context of the rest of the world? And I don't pretend any expertise. The reason I should have added this on the monetary policy side, especially in light of the nature of this conference. You all remember the taper tantrum? Okay. All right, so Bernanke gets up and says, well, maybe in our lifetime, interest rates will go up again. And everybody decided, oh, we're going to be okay, we're not Japan. And quite spectacularly in the US. The 10-year yield over 6 months went from 1.6 to 3%. The yield on the 2-year went from 18 basis points to 68 basis points. And in that environment, you began the process of wild reversal of the capital inflows into the emerging world. So something that was mildly important in the US, okay, he gave a speech, some of our interest rates went up, caused this disgorging of money into the developing world, and a lot of those countries, you can argue whether it was China or Bernanke, but some combination of China and Bernanke, and they went into deep recessions. Now, how do you conduct monetary policy? You can't pretend that you have a large closed economy where you can model what the 10-year yield does to housing, when in fact what the 10-year yield did was bring hundreds of billions back out of Brazil, out of much of the developing world, and those economies plunged. So in a global context, I think you'd have to deal with both the tax and the monetary policy.
Bob, how do you account for that in your Taylor rule?
How do you account for that in the Taylor rule? Okay, very good question. First of all, the whole idea that you can have an equation that tells you what to do, you know, all of my career that's been demonstrated to not be true, right? You can't get out from under judgment. Now, if you say, in the current circumstances, I gave you a long list of how employment in the US could do better than a simple Taylor rule suggests you might want to risk. We didn't even talk about what happens globally if you respond and how that might negatively affect things in the US. And of course, we didn't talk about the fact that you're not just designing policy associated with the modal outcome, you know, what's most likely to happen. You're also designing policy on the what ifs. And that's one of the other big pieces in a piece, again, quoting my buddy, John Faust. He said, well, imagine you're in a plane and the pilot comes on and he says, well, we're cruising at about 100 feet and it looks pretty good. And right now the wind shear is such that there's an equal chance that we'll get blown up 100 feet or down 100 feet. Now you might say, well, the risks are equal, but when I multiply them times the consequences, I'm a bit more concerned about the down 100 feet than I am the up 100 feet. And in the circumstances right now, that's not a bad description of the US, right? If you go up 100, if it turned out that the economy was much stronger and employment did much better and inflation accelerated somewhat over the next 4 years, I don't even know if I'm upset, but I'm certainly not apoplectic. Whereas, do you really want to find yourself trying to figure out how to make this thing go when you start with the funds rate at 37 basis points and it's turned back down? So when you put global and risk context in, the Taylor rule just isn't going to tell you what you need to do. Yes?
Given the price of everything, you know, in terms of what's priced, which is, I think a lot of people now sort of have the view that the U.S. and all developed markets are some form of derivative of Japan. And it's basically impossible for central banks to ever raise rates or create inflation. You've got every central bank out there that says, we want to create inflation, all the developed market central banks that say we want to create inflation. What happens if they're right? What happens if they get what they want?
And get inflation, you mean? Then they'll be happy.
I mean, how do markets sort of deal with that issue?
I guess, yeah, okay. I think first, a couple things. Geez, I must have had 25 screaming matches with a gentleman who's on regularly, CNBC, who'll remain nameless, for about 6 years. And I think it's important to realize that I'm anxious that inflation might take off. To me, it had a more reasonable sound to it about 6 years ago. Okay, it's been spectacularly missing in action now for a very long time. So much so that I think it would be somewhat welcome. And the point is, if you go back and look, it's not true that you, quote, let the genie out of the bottle. There isn't any sort of self-reinforcing positive second derivative associated with an inflation that begins to move up. And if you find yourself in a position where you have to deal with an inflation rate that's higher than you want, and enduring, you got 500 basis, you can tighten 1,000 basis points. Whereas if you find yourself with the economy turned down again, you're faced with all sorts of painful, negative rates, buying the 10-year, helicopter money, all sorts of stuff you really don't want any part of. Okay, that's the asymmetry to me. If you think about, I'd much rather have monetary policy in a firmer position, well, then run fiscal policy, right? Have a big fiscal thrust right now, and if you argue it's too much of a good thing and it requires some monetary tightening, well, maybe you'd actually find yourself with interest rates that were more traditionally able to respond to a declining economy. Yeah.
How can you respond to?
This will be the last one, I think.
How can you respond to rising inflation when you have $19 trillion in debt and government is the biggest debtor, and you have to pay the interest on that?
Yeah,
If interest rates were not 0.5% or 1.75% on the 10-year, but it's 3%.
Yeah, but I guess what I
lose that degree of freedom.
Yeah, I think the debt situation in the U.S., when I look around the world at countries with much higher debt to GDP ratios, deficits, much lower in terms of real economic prospects, and I look at their interest rates. Look at Italy. Italy right now is borrowing for 10 years at 120. Okay, and they don't even have a central bank that really is their back. Well, at least Draghi's Italian.
It's not their bank.
Right, and when you look at Japan to me is the most spectacular. Japan has raised the VAT 4 times over the last 25 years, and each time they raise the VAT, the economy tanks and the debt to GDP ratio goes up. I'd lower the VAT. Keep cutting it until the bond's 3%. It's been absolutely perverse now for 25 years. And their debt to GDP ratio, what is it now? 235, something like that? Okay, I have to stop now because he's giving me that look. Thank you.